The fire had long since died when Aveline Morecambe first opened her eyes to the cruelty of the world. She could not have been more than 4 winters old, small and shivering beneath a threadbare blanket that did nothing to keep the Highland cold from seeping into her bones. The cottage where she lived with her parents, Edric and Milas, sat at the farthest edge of the village of Greyholme, where the forest pressed close and the shadow of the mountains swallowed the sun before noon. It was a place forgotten by fortune, where even the earth seemed reluctant to yield crops, and the wind carried whispers of old curses. Her mother moved through the dim interior like a ghost, her face hollowed by hunger and disappointment. Her father spent his days in the fields that refused to prosper, returning each evening with dirt under his nails and silence on his lips. They had wanted a son. Aveline understood this without ever being told. She understood it in the way her mother's eyes slid past her, in the way her father never reached for her hand. She was the wrong child, born to the wrong family in the wrong season, and the knowledge of it sank into her small heart like a stone into deep water. The herbalists who lived 2 cottages down took pity on her. Old Marin and her daughter Thessaly were the closest thing to kindness Aveline knew in those early years. They taught her which roots could ease a fever, which leaves could knit a wound, which flowers bloomed only under the full moon and held magic in their petals. Aveline learned quickly, her small fingers nimble and her memory sharp. She would sit for hours in their garden, dirt beneath her nails, the scent of rosemary and sage filling her lungs, feeling for the first time that she might have purpose, that she might be something other than a disappointment. But the village of Greyholme was not a place that rewarded gentle girls who tended gardens. It was a place ruled by the pack laws, ancient and unyielding, where strength was measured in bloodlines and the ability to produce heirs. Women were vessels first, people second. The elders, gray-bearded men who gathered in the stone hall at the village center, decided fates with the casual cruelty of those who had never known powerlessness. They spoke of tradition as if it were sacred, of hierarchy as if it were natural law, and they looked at girls like Aveline, small and quiet and fatherless in all the ways that mattered, and saw only waste. When Aveline was 7, her mother fell ill. The sickness came in winter, creeping through the cottage like smoke, stealing warmth and breath. Aveline tried everything old Marin had taught her, brewing teas from willow bark, crushing herbs into poultices, sitting vigil through long nights while her father disappeared into the village tavern and returned reeking of ale and bitterness. But the fever would not break. Her mother died on a morning when frost covered the windows and the world outside was silent and white. They buried her in the thin soil behind the cottage, and her father did not weep. He only stared at the grave with empty eyes and said nothing. After that, the cottage became a tomb. Her father barely spoke, barely looked at her. He worked the fields and drank and disappeared for days at a time. Aveline learned to make herself small, to move quietly, to expect nothing. She continued to visit old Marin and Thessaly, finding refuge in their warm kitchen and gentle voices. They fed her when her father forgot, mended her clothes when they frayed, told her stories of the old magic that lived in the highlands, of the great wolves that could shift into men, of the ancient bloodlines that ruled the realm of Valdoran beyond the village borders. Valdoran was a name spoken with reverence and fear. It was the kingdom to the north, carved from forest and mountain, ruled by the Alpha King and his council of pack lords. The power of Valdoran reached even into small villages like Greyholme, enforcing laws, collecting tithes, sending soldiers when tribute was owed. The king himself was a figure of legend, a warrior who had claimed his throne through blood and battle, feared by enemies and respected even by those who resented his rule. His name was Cale Therion Blackmore, and children in Greyholme were told stories of his ferocity to keep them obedient. Aveline listened to these stories with a strange fascination. She imagined what it might be like to live in a place of stone towers and great halls, far from the cold cottage and her father's silence. But such thoughts were foolish, she knew. Girls like her did not rise above their stations. Girls like her were lucky to survive. When Aveline was 15, the fever came for her. It struck in the heart of summer, sudden and vicious, burning through her body like wildfire. She collapsed in old Marin's garden, the world spinning and darkening, her skin blazing hot to the touch. Thessaly carried her inside, calling for her mother, and together they fought to save her. For 3 days and nights, Aveline drifted in and out of consciousness, caught between waking and dreaming, her body racked with chills and fire. She saw her mother's face in the fever dreams, pale and sad, reaching for her across a great distance. She heard voices, low and urgent, speaking words she could not understand. On the 4th day, the fever broke. Aveline woke weak and hollow, her body little more than skin and bone, but alive. Old Marin wept with relief, and Thessaly held her hand and whispered prayers of gratitude to the old gods. But when the village elders came to assess her recovery, they did not share in the celebration. They examined her with cold eyes and colder hands, muttering among themselves, shaking their heads. And then they delivered their verdict. The fever had rendered her barren, infertile, incapable of bearing children. It was a proclamation rooted more in superstition than medicine, a cruel assumption based on old wives' tales and the desire to explain away what frightened them. But once spoken, it became truth. In a society where a woman's value was measured by her womb, where bloodlines were sacred and heirs were currency, Aveline Morcan was declared worthless. The news spread through Greyholm like poison. Neighbors who had ignored her before now whispered when she passed. Children threw stones and called her names she did not understand but felt in her chest like blows. Her father, already distant, became a stranger entirely. He looked at her with something worse than anger, worse than disappointment. He looked at her with resignation, as if she were a problem he had been waiting to solve. Aveline continued to work with old Marin and Thessaly, but even there the warmth had cooled. They still taught her, still spoke kindly, but there was pity now in their eyes, and pity was its own kind of wound. She knew what people were saying. She was a burden, a waste of resources. A girl who would never marry, never produce heirs, never fulfill the only purpose her society recognized. She was nothing. Her father began to drink more heavily. Debts piled up, coins borrowed from neighbors and merchants and never repaid. The cottage fell into further disrepair, the roof leaking, the walls cracking, the garden overgrown. Aveline tried to hold things together, tending what she could, but it was like trying to catch water in her hands. Everything slipped away. And then, 2 months after her 16th birthday, her father made his decision. He came home one evening with 2 men Aveline had never seen before, soldiers wearing the dark blue cloaks of the royal house of Valdoren. They looked at her with the same cold assessment the elders had used, weighing her worth. Her father spoke in low tones with them, and Aveline understood before a word was said aloud. She was being sold. The soldiers explained with bureaucratic efficiency that the royal palace required servants, workers for the kitchens and gardens and stables. Her father would receive compensation for her service, enough to settle his debts and perhaps more. She would be housed and fed, given work suited to her limited value. It was, they assured her, a mercy. Many families would be grateful for such an opportunity. Aveline looked at her father, waiting for him to protest, to refuse, to show even the smallest flicker of reluctance. But he only nodded, his face expressionless, and held out his hand for the coins they offered. She realized in that moment that he had been waiting for this, hoping for it. She was not his daughter. She was a debt he could finally pay. They gave her 1 night to gather her belongings. She had almost nothing to take, only the clothes on her back and a small leather pouch of dried herbs. Old Marin pressed into her hands with tears in her eyes. Thessaly embraced her and whispered apologies, as if any of this were her fault. Her father did not say goodbye. When the soldiers came for her in the morning, he was already gone, disappeared into the village or the tavern or simply away. Anywhere he did not have to watch her leave. The journey to the palace took 3 days. They traveled north through forests that grew darker and denser, through valleys where mist clung to the ground and the air smelled of pine and old magic. The soldiers did not speak to her except to give orders. She rode in the back of a wagon with supplies, wrapped in a thin blanket, watching the world she had known disappear behind her. She did not weep. Tears required hope, and she had none. Valdoran revealed itself slowly, rising from the landscape like something carved from the mountains themselves. The palace was a sprawling fortress of gray stone and dark towers, surrounded by walls thick enough to withstand siege, perched on a cliff that overlooked the wild forests below. Smoke rose from countless chimneys, and the sound of the place reached her before she could see it clearly, a low hum of life and work and power. They brought her through a side gate, away from the grand entrance where nobles and dignitaries would arrive. She was taken to the servants' quarters, a warren of small rooms and narrow hallways built into the lower levels of the palace. A stern-faced woman named Haldis, who managed the household staff, looked Aveline up and down with the practiced eye of someone who had seen 1,000 girls just like her. Haldis assigned her to the inner gardens, the medicinal plots that supplied the palace healers and kitchens. It was considered low work, dirty work, but Aveline felt a strange relief. Gardens, she understood. Plants did not judge. The earth did not care about bloodlines or fertility. She could disappear into the work, and perhaps, if she was lucky, be forgotten. The gardens were extensive, terraced into the hillside behind the palace, protected by high walls and accessible only through guarded gates. There were beds of lavender and thyme, plots of sage and rosemary, rare plants that bloomed only in shadow, vines that climbed the stone walls and produced flowers used in healing drafts. Other servants worked there too, but they kept their distance. Word of her condition had traveled faster than she had, whispered from soldier to servant, from servant to cook, from cook to stable hand. Everyone knew what she was. Everyone knew she was broken. Aveline worked from dawn until dusk, her hands in the soil, her back bent over rows of green. She learned the rhythms of the palace, the bells that marked the hours, the shifts of guards, the routines of nobility who passed through the gardens on their way to private chambers. She learned to make herself invisible, to move through spaces without drawing attention, to exist as little more than a shadow. The palace itself was a place of cold beauty. The halls were lined with tapestries depicting great battles and ancient bloodlines. The walls hung with weapons and shields bearing the sigils of powerful families. Everywhere there was a sense of history and weight, of traditions so old they had become law. The pack hierarchy was visible in every interaction, in the way lesser nobles bowed to greater ones, in the way servants averted their eyes from anyone of rank, in the brutal efficiency with which order was maintained. Aveline saw the Alpha King only from a distance in those early months. He was a figure who moved through the palace like a storm, tall and broad-shouldered, his presence commanding attention even when he said nothing. Cale Therian Blackmore was 31 years old, a widower. His mate lost 3 years prior in circumstances no servant dared discuss openly. He was attended always by guards and advisors, his face stern, his eyes the color of winter storms. People stepped aside when he approached, their heads bowed, their voices silenced. He was power made flesh, authority absolute. Aveline told herself not to look at him, not to draw his attention, not to exist in any space he occupied. She was less than nothing in this place, and survival meant remaining that way. But she could not help the curiosity that tugged at her when she glimpsed him walking the upper terrace, could not suppress the strange pull she felt when his voice carried down through the garden walls, deep and commanding. She told herself it was only fear, only the natural response of prey in the presence of a predator, nothing more. But the gardens held their own kind of magic, and Aveline was not as invisible as she believed. The seasons turned slowly in Valdoran, marked not by the gentle passage of time, but by the harsh demands of survival. Winter came early to the highlands, wrapping the palace in snow and ice, turning the gardens into a frozen wasteland that required constant vigilance to protect the delicate plants. Aveline worked through the cold, her fingers numb, her breath visible in the air, wrapping the tender herbs in cloth and building small fires in clay pots to keep the frost from killing them. The other servants thought her foolish for caring so much, but she could not help it. The plants were the only living things that did not recoil from her touch. By her second winter at the palace, Aveline had settled into a routine of quiet endurance. She woke before dawn, broke her fast with whatever bread and weak tea the kitchens provided, and made her way to the gardens as the first gray light touched the mountains. She worked until the bells rang for midday meal, ate alone in the corner of the servants' hall, then returned to the gardens until dusk. In the evenings, she retreated to the small room she shared with 3 other servant girls, none of whom spoke to her beyond necessity. They thought her cursed, tainted by her infertility, and kept their distance as if misfortune might spread like disease. Aveline did not mind the isolation. She had learned long ago that loneliness was safer than companionship, that expecting nothing meant never being disappointed. She kept her head down, did her work, and tried not to think about the life she might have had if she had been born whole, born wanted, born into a world that valued something other than bloodlines and heirs. But the palace was not a place where anyone could truly disappear. It was a hive of activity and intrigue, where every servant knew the business of every noble, where gossip flowed as freely as wine, where alliances shifted like sand and favor could be won or lost on a whisper. Aveline overheard things as she worked, fragments of conversation that drifted down from the upper terraces, stories told in the kitchens, rumors passed between guards. She learned that the Alpha King was under constant pressure from his council to remarry, to secure the succession, to forge alliances through political matches with the daughters of powerful families. She learned that he had refused every proposal, that his advisors grew more frustrated with each passing season, that some whispered he still mourned his lost mate, while others suggested darker reasons for his reluctance. She learned, too, that the court was a dangerous place, full of ambitious nobles who saw the king's unwillingness to remarry as weakness, who schemed and plotted and jockeyed for position. There were rumors of unrest in the outer territories, of rival pacts testing Valdoran's borders, of whispers that questioned whether a king without heirs could hold the realm together. The stability Chael Tharian Blackmore had built through strength and strategy was fragile, balanced on the edge of a blade, and everyone knew it. Aveline told herself these matters were far above her, that the concerns of kings and councils had nothing to do with a servant girl who tended gardens. But she could not help listening, could not suppress the strange fascination she felt when she heard his name spoken, when she glimpsed him from a distance, when his presence seemed to charge the very air of the palace with something she could not name. It was in her 3rd spring at Valdoran that everything began to change. The gardens had survived the winter, and Aveline spent her days coaxing new growth from the thawed earth, pruning dead branches, planting seeds for the coming season. She was alone one morning, kneeling in the dirt beside a bed of young lavender, when she heard footsteps on the stone path behind her. She did not turn, assuming it was one of the other gardeners or perhaps a guard making rounds. But the footsteps stopped, and a voice spoke, deep and measured and utterly unfamiliar in its directness. "You are Aveline Morkant." It was not a question. Aveline's heart seized in her chest. She knew that voice, had heard it carried on the wind, had felt its weight even from a distance. Slowly, carefully, she turned and looked up, and found herself staring at the Alpha King. Chael Tharian Blackmore stood on the path above her, dressed not in the formal regalia she had seen from afar, but in simple dark clothing, a cloak thrown over his shoulders, his hair tied back from his face. He was broader and taller than she had realized, his presence overwhelming even without the trappings of royalty. His eyes were gray and sharp, fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to look away but held her frozen. There was something in his gaze she could not read, something between curiosity and recognition, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle he had not expected to find. Aveline realized she was still kneeling in the dirt, her hands filthy, her hair falling loose from its braid. She scrambled to her feet, nearly tripping over her own skirts, and bowed her head the way servants were taught. "Your Majesty," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "You tend these gardens," he said. It was not a question, but she answered anyway. "Yes, Your Majesty. The medicinal plants, the herbs for the healers." He stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel path, and she fought the urge to step back. He was looking at the garden now, at the neat rows she had cultivated, the careful organization of plants, the small labels she had made from scraps of wood to mark each bed. "You do good work," he said. "The head healer speaks highly of the quality of what you provide." Aveline did not know what to say to that. Praise was foreign to her, especially from someone so far above her station. She kept her eyes on the ground and murmured, "Thank you, Your Majesty." There was a long silence. She could feel him watching her, could sense the weight of his attention like a physical thing. And then he asked, "How long have you been here?" "Nearly 3 years, Your Majesty." "And before that?" "Greyholm, Your Majesty." "A village to the south." Another silence. She risked a glance up and found him still watching her, his expression unreadable. "You are young to have such skill with plants," he said. "I was taught by herbalists in my village, Your Majesty. I have been working with plants since I was a child." He nodded slowly, as if filing away this information. And then, to her complete shock, he asked, "Are you content here?" The question was so unexpected, so utterly outside the bounds of what she thought possible, that Aveline could only stare at him. Content? No one had ever asked her such a thing. No one had ever cared. She opened her mouth, closed it, tried to find words that would not sound like lies or complaints or anything that might displease him. "I am grateful for the work, Your Majesty," she said carefully. "The gardens are a good place." Something flickered in his eyes, something that might have been disappointment or understanding. She could not tell. He nodded once. "Continue your work, Aveline Morcant," he said. And then he turned and walked away, his cloak sweeping behind him, leaving her standing alone in the garden with her heart pounding and her mind reeling. She told herself it meant nothing. Kings did not concern themselves with servants. He had probably been inspecting the gardens on a whim, had spoken to her out of idle curiosity, would forget her existence the moment he returned to the halls of power. But the encounter stayed with her, replaying in her mind as she worked, as she lay in her narrow bed at night, as she moved through the days that followed. She could not shake the feeling that something had shifted, that a door had opened somewhere she could not yet see. And she was right, because the Alpha King began to appear in the gardens with increasing frequency. Not every day, but often enough that it became a pattern. He would walk the paths in the early morning or late afternoon, sometimes alone, sometimes with a guard at a distance. And he would stop where Aveline was working, and he would ask her questions. Simple questions at first. "What are you planting? How do you know when to harvest? What does this plant do?" She answered carefully, keeping her responses brief and factual, never presuming familiarity, never forgetting the vast gulf between them. But the questions continued, and slowly, imperceptibly, they began to change. He asked about her village, about her training, about what she thought of Valdoran. He listened to her answers with a focus that unnerved her, as if her words mattered, as if she were something more than a servant who could be dismissed and forgotten. The other servants noticed, of course. They watched with suspicious eyes when the king paused to speak with her, whispered among themselves when he was gone. Aveline could feel the shift in how they treated her, the way they watched her as if waiting for her to make a mistake, to overstep, to give them reason to report her. She tried to make herself smaller, to work harder, to prove she was not seeking attention or favor. But the king kept coming, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. One morning, nearly a month after their first conversation, Kale arrived in the garden just as Aveline was finishing her work for the day. The sun was high, the air warm, and she was kneeling beside a bed of rosemary, her hands stained green from pruning. She sensed his presence before she heard him, that strange pull she had felt from the beginning, and looked up to find him watching her from the edge of the path. "Walk with me," he said. It was not a request. Aveline set down her shears, wiped her hands on her apron, and stood. She fell into step beside him, or rather behind him, the proper place for a servant, but he glanced back and gestured for her to walk at his side. It felt wrong, transgressive, but she obeyed. They walked in silence through the gardens, past the herb beds and the flowering vines, toward the far wall where a stone bench sat beneath an old oak tree. He stopped there and gestured for her to sit. She hesitated, but he sat first, and after a moment she lowered herself onto the far edge of the bench, as much distance between them as possible. "You are afraid of me," he said. It was not a question. You are the king, Aveline replied quietly. Everyone is afraid of you, Your Majesty. That is not what I asked. She looked at her hands, at the dirt under her nails, the calluses on her palms. I do not know what you want me to say, Your Majesty. The truth would suffice. She drew a breath, choosing her words carefully. I am not afraid you will hurt me, but I am afraid of what it means that you speak to me at all. And what do you think it means? I do not know, she admitted. But nothing good comes to people like me when we draw the attention of people like you. He was silent for a long moment, and when she dared to glance at him, she found him watching her with something that looked almost like sadness. You have been taught that you are worthless, he said quietly. It was not a question, but the truth of it hit her like a blow. She looked away, her throat tight. I have been taught what I am, she said. That is all. And what are you? Broken, she said. The word came out flat, matter of fact, stripped of emotion because to feel it would be unbearable. Infertile, of no value to anyone. Do you believe that? She wanted to lie, to give him the answer she thought he wanted, but something in his tone demanded honesty. It does not matter what I believe, she said. It is what everyone else believes. It is the truth this world recognizes. This world is wrong. The certainty in his voice startled her. She looked at him fully then, searching his face for mockery or pity, but found neither. He looked angry, but not at her, at something larger, something she could not name. Your Majesty, she began, but he cut her off. My name is Kale. I cannot call you that, she said quickly. It would be, I am giving you permission. It does not matter. Others will hear. I will be punished. Not by me, by everyone else. He leaned back against the bench, his expression frustrated. You are right, he said after a moment. This place is cruel to those it deems lesser. I have tried to change it, but tradition has roots deeper than I can reach alone. He looked at her again, and there was something in his eyes she could not read. But I can still choose who I speak with. I can still decide whose voice I want to hear. And I find that I want to hear yours, Aveline Morcon. She did not know what to say to that, did not know how to respond to the idea that a king might value her words, her presence, her existence. It felt like a dream, fragile and impossible, the kind of thing that would shatter the moment she reached for it. Why? She asked finally, the question barely a whisper. He did not answer immediately. He looked out at the gardens, at the mountains beyond the walls, at the sky where clouds gathered over distant peaks. Because you do not want anything from me, he said at last. Because you speak to me as if I am a person, not a title. Because when I am near you, I feel something I have not felt in a very long time. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter. Peace. Aveline's heart was pounding so hard she thought he must hear it. She wanted to tell him he was mistaken, that she was no one, that this peace he felt was an illusion that would crumble under scrutiny. But she could not speak, could only sit beside him in the shade of the oak tree, the silence between them heavy with words neither knew how to say. After a time, Kale stood. I will not force my presence on you, he said, but I will continue to walk these gardens. And if you wish to speak with me, I will listen. He left her there, and Aveline sat alone beneath the tree for a long time, her mind spinning, her chest tight with something between hope and terror. She knew that nothing good could come of this. She knew that she was playing with fire, that the court would devour her the moment they sensed what was happening. But she also knew, with a certainty that terrified her, that she wanted to see him again, wanted to hear his voice, to sit in that strange peace he spoke of, to feel for a moment like she was something other than what the world had named her. And so, when he returned to the gardens the next day, she did not hide. She did not run. She met his eyes, and she spoke. And slowly, carefully, a bond began to form between them, fragile as spider silk and just as dangerous. The summer arrived with unusual warmth, turning the gardens into a riot of color and scent. Aveline spent her days moving between the plots, harvesting herbs at their peak, drying lavender in bundles that hung from the rafters of the garden shed, preparing tinctures and salves for the palace healers, Her hands were never idle, her mind never quiet, but now there was something new woven through her days, something that made her heart quicken when she heard footsteps on the gravel paths, something that made the endless work feel less like survival and more like waiting. Cale came to the gardens almost daily now, sometimes in the morning before the court demanded his attention, sometimes in the evening when the light turned golden and the air cooled. They spoke of small things at first, safe things. He asked about the properties of different plants, and she explained which were poisonous and which could heal, which bloomed in shadow and which required sun. He told her about the forests beyond the palace walls, about the ancient trees that had stood for centuries, about the wolves that hunted in packs and the old magic that still lingered in the deep places. She listened with fascination, these glimpses into a world she would never see, a life so far removed from her own it might as well have been a fairy tale. But gradually, slowly, the conversations deepened. He told her about the weight of the crown, about the endless demands of ruling a realm where tradition often clashed with justice, where every decision carried consequences that rippled far beyond what he could see. He spoke of his late mate, though not in detail, just enough for Aveline to understand that the loss had carved something out of him that had never fully healed. He spoke of the council that pressured him constantly, of the nobles who saw him as a means to their own ends, of the isolation that came with power. And Aveline, carefully, tentatively, began to share her own story. She told him about Greyholm, about her mother's death and her father's abandonment. She told him about the fever that had stolen her future, about the elders who had condemned her, about the way her own father had sold her to settle his debts. She spoke of these things without self-pity, stating facts the way one might describe the weather. But Cale listened with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she had never experienced. He did not offer empty comfort or platitudes. He simply heard her, and somehow that was enough. The servants' whispers grew louder. Aveline could feel their eyes on her constantly now, could sense the resentment building like a storm on the horizon. The other garden workers began to give her more difficult tasks, assigning her the beds that required the most labor, the plots farthest from the palace where she would be most isolated. Haldis, the household manager, called her in one evening and questioned her sharply about her interactions with the king. Aveline answered truthfully, said they spoke of plants and nothing more, but she could see the disbelief in the woman's eyes. She was walking a dangerous path, she knew this, but she could not seem to stop herself, could not seem to refuse when Cale appeared in the garden with that look in his eyes that said he needed the peace she somehow provided. It was on a warm evening in late summer that everything shifted again. Aveline was working late, taking advantage of the long twilight to finish transplanting a bed of young sage. The garden was empty, the other workers long since departed for their evening meal. She was so absorbed in her task that she did not hear Cale approach until he was standing directly beside her. "You work too hard," he said. She looked up, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "The plants do not care about the hour, Your Majesty. They grow when they are ready." He smiled, a rare expression that transformed his usually stern face. "You have dirt on your cheek," he said. She reached up to wipe it away, but he was faster. His hand came up, his fingers brushing her skin, wiping away the smudge with a gentleness that froze her in place. The touch lasted only a second, but it seemed to echo through her entire body, leaving her breathless and confused. He drew his hand back quickly, as if realizing what he had done, and for a moment they simply stared at each other. "I should not have done that," he said quietly. "No," she agreed, her voice barely audible. "You should not have." But neither of them moved. The air between them felt charged, heavy with something Aveline did not have words for. She knew she should step back, should bow and excuse herself, should run from this moment before it consumed her, but she could not move, could not look away from his eyes, gray and stormy and fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel like she was standing at the edge of a precipice. "Aveline," he said, and his voice was rough, almost pained. "I do not know what is happening here, but I cannot seem to stay away from you." "Your Majesty." "Cale," he interrupted. "Please, when we are alone, call me Cale." "I cannot," she whispered. You know I cannot. Why? Because of tradition? Because of laws written by men who never questioned whether they were just? Because I am no one, she said, and the words came out sharper than she intended. Because I am a servant girl who is broken and worthless, and you are a king who needs to secure his line and his realm. Because this, she gestured between them, whatever this is, it can only end in pain. You believe that? I know that. He was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides. And then he said, "What if you are wrong? What if the world that taught you to believe these things is the thing that is broken, not you?" Aveline felt something crack inside her chest, something she had kept carefully sealed for so many years. "Do not do this," she said, and her voice shook. "Do not give me hope when you know it is impossible. Do not make me want things I can never have." "What do you want?" he asked, stepping closer. "It does not matter what I want. It matters to me." "Why?" she demanded, and all the frustration and fear and confusion came spilling out. "Why do you care what a servant girl wants? Why do you keep coming here? What could you possibly gain from this?" "Nothing," he said simply. "I gain nothing. I risk everything. My advisors would be furious if they knew how much time I spend in these gardens. My council already questions my judgment, my ability to rule, my refusal to remarry. And yet I keep coming back, because when I am with you, I feel like myself again. Not the king, not the warrior, just a man who can breathe without the weight of a crown crushing him." Aveline closed her eyes, trying to steady herself, trying to think past the way her heart was pounding. "You cannot say these things to me," she said. "Why not?" "Because I will believe you, and believing you will destroy me when reality returns. And if I mean them?" She opened her eyes and looked at him, really looked at him, searching his face for any hint of deception or delusion. But she found only raw honesty, and that terrified her more than anything else. "Then we are both fools," she said quietly. Kyle reached for her hand, slowly, giving her time to pull away. She did not. His fingers closed around hers, warm and rough and solid. And for a moment they stood there in the gathering darkness, connected by nothing but a touch that felt like both a promise and a condemnation. "I do not know where this leads," he said, "but I know I cannot walk away from it, from you, not yet." Aveline wanted to tell him he must, that there was no future here, that the court would tear her apart the moment they realized what was happening. But the words would not come, because despite everything, despite all the reasons this was impossible, she did not want him to walk away either. "This will not end well," she said instead. "Perhaps not," he agreed, "but I have learned that very few things do." He released her hand and stepped back, and Aveline felt the loss of his touch like a physical ache. "I should go," he said. "The council will be wondering where I am." She nodded, not trusting her voice. He turned to leave, then paused and looked back at her. "Aveline," he said, "whatever happens, know that I have never thought of you as broken. Never." And then he was gone, disappearing into the shadows between the garden walls, leaving her standing alone with her heart in ruins and her mind in chaos. The following days were both easier and harder. Easier because Kale seemed to understand the danger they were courting and kept more distance, his visits shorter and less frequent. Harder because Aveline could not stop thinking about that evening, about the touch of his hand, about the way he had looked at her as if she were something precious and rare. She tried to lose herself in work, tried to focus on the plants and the earth and the simple rhythms that had always grounded her. But everything felt different now, charged with a tension she could not release. And then the whispers reached the council. Aveline did not know who had spoken first, which servant had carried tales to which noble, but suddenly the palace was alive with gossip. The Alpha King was spending time with a servant girl. Not just any servant girl, but one who was infertile, useless, incapable of providing heirs. The scandal spread like wildfire through the court, and Aveline could feel the weight of it pressing down on her from every direction. Haldis summoned her one morning, her face grim. "The council wishes to see you," she said without preamble. Aveline's blood turned to ice. "Why?" "You know why," Haldis said. You have drawn attention you should never have sought. Now you will face the consequences." They took her to a chamber deep in the palace, a cold stone room lit by torches and filled with stern-faced men in formal robes. The council members sat in a semicircle, their expressions ranging from disapproval to barely concealed contempt. At the center sat Lord Harrow, the king's chief advisor, an old man with silver hair and eyes like chips of ice. Aveline stood before them, her hands clasped to keep them from shaking, her head bowed. She could feel their judgment like a physical weight, could sense the verdict that had already been reached before she ever entered the room. "You are Aveline Morcant," Lord Harrow said. It was not a question. "Yes, my lord." "You have been working in the palace gardens for 3 years." "Yes, my lord." "And in that time, you have formed an inappropriate attachment to His Majesty." Aveline's chest tightened. "I have spoken with His Majesty when he has chosen to walk the gardens, my lord. Nothing more." "Do not lie to us, girl," another council member snapped. "You have been seen with him repeatedly. You have monopolized his time, distracted him from his duties, encouraged his attention through whatever feminine wiles you possess." "I have done no such thing," Aveline said, struggling to keep her voice steady. "I have answered his questions when asked and conducted myself with appropriate respect. I have sought nothing from him, except his favor," Lord Harrow said coldly. "His protection, his affection. You may think yourself clever, positioning yourself as something different, something vulnerable that might appeal to his sense of honor. But we see through you. My lord, I have not—" "Silence," Lord Harrow commanded. "Your background is known to us. You are infertile, barren, incapable of providing heirs. You are of no value to this kingdom or its future, and yet you have somehow convinced the king to waste his time on you, rather than pursuing an appropriate match that would strengthen Valdoran and secure the succession." Aveline felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. "I have convinced him of nothing, my lord. I did not seek his attention." "Perhaps not initially," Lord Harrow conceded, "but you have certainly done nothing to discourage it, and that ends now." He leaned forward, his gaze pinning her in place. "You are dismissed from the palace gardens, effective immediately. You will be reassigned to the laundries in the lower levels, where you will have no opportunity to encounter His Majesty. And if you attempt to seek him out, if you make any effort to continue this inappropriate association, you will be expelled from the palace entirely and returned to wherever unfortunate village spawned you. Do you understand?" Aveline's throat was so tight she could barely speak. "Yes, my lord." "Good. You are dismissed." They sent her away with guards, as if she were a criminal, as if she had committed some terrible crime rather than simply existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. They took her to the lower levels of the palace, to the hot, humid laundry rooms where servants worked in shifts washing the endless linens and clothing required by the court. The work was backbreaking, the air thick with steam and the smell of lye, the hours long and the conditions brutal. Aveline was assigned to one of the washing tubs, given a pile of soiled linens taller than she was, and told to work. She worked, because that was what she had always done, what she had been taught to do. She scrubbed and wrung and hung and carried, her hands raw, her back aching, her mind numb. The other laundry workers ignored her, having been warned she was trouble, and she was grateful for it. She did not want their sympathy or their questions. She wanted only to disappear into the work and forget that there had ever been a garden, ever been a king who had looked at her as if she mattered, but forgetting was impossible. At night, lying in her narrow bed, she could not stop thinking about Cale, about the way he had touched her face, the way he had held her hand, the way he had said her name as if it were something precious. She wondered if he knew what the council had done, if he had fought for her, or if he had simply let them remove her from his path. She wondered if he had already forgotten her, if their conversations had meant as little to him as everyone seemed to assume they had. She told herself it did not matter, that she had always known this would end badly, that she had been a fool to hope for anything different. But it hurt. It hurt more than she had thought possible, more than the fever or the rejection or the years of loneliness, because for a brief moment she had felt seen. She had felt valued. She had felt like maybe, Just maybe. She was something other than broken. And now she was back where she belonged. In the darkness. In the steam. In the place where girls like her were meant to stay. 3 weeks passed in the laundries. 3 weeks of steam and scalding water. Of hands that cracked and bled. Of a back that ached so deeply Aveline could barely straighten when the day's work was done. 3 weeks of silence and isolation. Of lying awake at night wondering if this was how the rest of her life would unfold. One endless day of toil bleeding into the next until she was too old or too broken to be of use, and was cast out entirely. She tried not to think about the gardens, about the smell of lavender and the feel of soil beneath her fingers. She tried not to think about Cale, about the way his voice had sounded when he spoke her name, about the impossible hope that had bloomed in her chest during those stolen conversations. She tried to accept that she had been foolish, that she had allowed herself to want something that was never meant for her, and that the punishment she now endured was exactly what she deserved. But on the 22nd day, everything changed again. Aveline was scrubbing a pile of tablecloths when one of the guards appeared in the doorway of the laundry room, his expression grim. "Aveline Morcant," he called out, and every worker in the room turned to stare. Aveline's stomach dropped. She set down the cloth she had been working on, wiped her hands on her apron, and approached him with her head bowed. "Yes, sir? You are to come with me. Now." Fear spiked through her. "Where am I being taken?" "You will find out. Move." The guard led her through the palace corridors. Upstairs she had never climbed, past chambers she had never seen. With each step, her dread grew. Were they expelling her? Had she done something wrong without realizing it? Had the council decided that banishing her to the laundries was not punishment enough? The guard stopped before a large wooden door, knocked twice, and pushed it open without waiting for a response. The room beyond was vast, lined with books and maps, dominated by a great stone fireplace where a fire burned despite the warmth of the day. And standing before that fire, his back to the door, was Cale. The guard nudged Aveline forward and then withdrew, closing the door behind him. She stood frozen, her heart hammering, her mind spinning. She had not seen Cale since that evening in the garden, had not heard his voice, had not known if he even remembered her existence. He turned slowly, and the sight of him hit her like a physical blow. He looked tired, shadows beneath his eyes, his face drawn and tense. But when his gaze found her, something shifted in his expression, something between relief and anguish. "Aveline," he said, and his voice was rough. She did not know what to say, what to do. She dropped into a curtsy, keeping her eyes on the floor. "Your Majesty, look at me," he said. It was not a command, but a plea. Slowly, she lifted her eyes to his. "I did not know," he said. "I swear to you I did not know what they had done until 2 days ago. I was told you had requested a transfer, that you wished to work elsewhere. They lied to me." Aveline's throat tightened. "It does not matter, Your Majesty. It matters to me," he said fiercely. He crossed the room toward her, and she resisted the urge to step back. "They had no right to punish you for my actions. They had no right to remove you from work you love and send you to the laundries like a criminal. They had every right," Aveline said quietly. "They are protecting you, protecting the realm. I am nothing, Your Majesty. My presence near you was inappropriate and they corrected it. That is all." "Do not say that," Kyle said, and there was anger in his voice now, though she knew it was not directed at her. "Do not reduce yourself to nothing because that is what others have told you to believe." "It is not a belief," she said. "It is a fact. I am infertile. In a world where bloodlines and heirs are everything, I am worthless. The council knows this. They are right to keep me away from you. The council does not dictate my life." "Yes, they do," Aveline said, and the words came out sharper than she intended. "They dictate everything. Who you see, who you marry, how you rule. They have shaped every aspect of your existence since the day you took the crown. And they are right to do so, because you are not just a man. You are a king, and kings must think beyond themselves." Kyle stared at her, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides. "And what if I do not want to be just a king? What if I want to be a man who can choose his own path? Then you should not have accepted the crown, Aveline said simply. The words hung between them, brutal and true. Kyle turned away, his shoulders tense, and for a long moment there was only silence. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. I did not ask you here to argue. I asked you here to tell you that I am removing you from the laundries. You will return to the gardens, where you belong. Aveline's breath caught. Your Majesty, the council— I will deal with the council. They will not allow it. They will fight you on this. Let them fight, Kale said, turning back to face her. I am done letting them control every aspect of my existence. I am done pretending that their fears and prejudices should dictate my choices. This is not about your choices, Aveline said desperately. This is about me, about what I am, about what I cannot give you. I have not asked you for anything, Kale said. But they will, Aveline insisted. The council, the court, the realm, they will demand heirs. They will demand alliances. They will demand that you marry someone who can secure the future of Valdoran. And I cannot be that person. I can never be that person. I know, Kale said, and the admission seemed to cost him something. I know what the world expects, what duty demands. But I am not asking you to be my queen, Aveline. I am not asking you to bear heirs or forge alliances or be anything other than what you are. I am simply asking if I can continue to speak with you, to see you, to have something in my life that is not about strategy or power or the endless weight of expectation. Aveline felt tears burning behind her eyes. And when the time comes that you must marry, when you must choose a mate who can give you what the realm needs, what then? I do not know, Kale admitted. But I know that I am not ready to lose what we have found, however fragile and impossible it may be. What we have found? Aveline repeated. We have had a few conversations in a garden, that is all. Is it? Kale asked, and he stepped closer, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the pain he was trying to hide. Because for me, it has been more than that. For me, those conversations have been the only moments of peace I have known in years. You do not look at me with fear or ambition or calculation. You do not want anything from me except to be heard. And he stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. I find that I need that. Need you. In whatever capacity you are willing to allow. Aveline looked up at him, at this powerful man who ruled a realm and commanded armies, and saw only vulnerability, saw only loneliness that matched her own. And she knew, with terrible clarity, that she could not refuse him, not because he was the king, but because she did not want to. Because she too had found something in their conversations, something that made the endless hardship of her existence feel bearable. Because despite everything, despite all the reasons it was impossible, she wanted to see him again. If I return to the gardens, she said slowly, the council will be furious. Yes, they will make my life difficult. I will do everything in my power to protect you. That may not be enough. I know. Aveline drew a shaky breath. And when the time comes that you must marry, you will do so. You will choose someone appropriate, someone who can give you heirs and alliances and everything the realm needs. And I will not stand in the way of that. Agreed, Kyle said, though the words sounded like it cut him. Then I will return to the gardens, Aveline said, but only on one condition. What condition? That you promise me. When the end comes, you will not look back. You will not grieve what we had. You will simply move forward, as kings must do. Kale looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something break in his eyes. But he nodded. I promise. It was a lie. They both knew it was a lie. But it was the lie they needed to move forward, to take this impossible thing and hold it for as long as they could before reality tore it from their grasp. Aveline returned to the gardens the next day. The other workers watched her with suspicious eyes, whispering among themselves, but no one confronted her directly. Word had spread that the king himself had ordered her return, and no one dared contradict him openly, though the resentment was palpable. She threw herself into the work, tending the plants that had been neglected in her absence, repairing the damage that 3 weeks without proper care had caused. And when Kale came to walk the paths, as she knew he would, she did not hide. They spoke as they had before, but there was a new weight to their conversations now, a knowledge that hung between them unspoken. They both knew this could not last. They both knew that eventually, the council would force his hand. That duty would demand he choose a mate who could secure the succession. But for now, in this fragile present, they had each other. And that was enough. Summer faded into autumn. The gardens began their slow transformation, leaves turning gold and red, the air growing crisp and cool. Aveline harvested the last of the herbs before the first frost, preparing the beds for winter, storing seeds for the spring that would come. And through it all, Kyle was there, walking beside her, speaking of things that mattered and things that did not, simply existing in her presence as she existed in his. But the peace could not hold. In the 10th month of her return to the gardens, word reached the palace that Aveline's parents had arrived at the gates, demanding to see their daughter. Aveline's blood turned to ice when she was given this news. She had not seen Edric and Malus Morcant in nearly 4 years, had not thought of them beyond the occasional bitter memory. They had sold her, discarded her, sent her away without a backward glance. Why would they come now? The answer became clear the moment she was brought to the receiving hall where they waited. Her father looked older, his face lined and haggard, but his eyes were sharp with calculation. Her mother stood behind him, silent and subservient as always, her gaze not quite meeting Aveline's. And between them, clear as day, was the realization that they had heard the rumors. They knew that the Alpha King had shown favor to their daughter, and they had come to profit from it. "Aveline," her father said, his voice falsely warm. "Look at you, my child. How you have grown." Aveline said nothing. She stood before them, her hands clasped, her face carefully neutral. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her pain. "We have come to see how you are faring," her father continued, "to ensure you are being treated well, that you are safe and healthy." "I am fine," Aveline said flatly. "Good, good," Edric said. "We have heard remarkable things. They say the king himself walks with you in the gardens, that he values your counsel." There it was, the reason they had come. Aveline's stomach churned with disgust. "His Majesty sometimes walks the palace grounds. I tend the gardens. Occasionally our paths cross." "How fortunate," her father said, and his smile was predatory. "And we understand that his council has been pressuring him to remarry, to choose a mate who can secure the succession." "I would know nothing of such matters," Aveline said. "Of course not," Edric agreed. "But we thought perhaps, given your unique position, you might be able to speak on behalf of your family, to help facilitate alliances, connections. There are debts that still burden us, you understand. Opportunities that have been denied. But with the right word in the right ear, from someone the king trusts—" "I will not do that," Aveline interrupted. "I will not use whatever small regard His Majesty may have for me to benefit people who sold me like livestock." Her father's expression darkened. "You ungrateful child. We gave you life. We raised you. And when circumstances demanded it, we ensured you had a position in the royal palace itself. And this is how you repay us? You sold me to settle your debts," Aveline said, and her voice was cold. "You cast me aside the moment I became inconvenient. You have no right to ask anything of me now. We have every right." Her mother spoke for the first time, her voice thin and bitter. "You are our daughter, our blood, and you will do as we say." Aveline looked at the woman who had given birth to her, who had moved through her childhood like a ghost, who had never once offered comfort or affection or love. "No," she said simply, "I will not." Her father took a step forward, his face flushed with anger. "You will regret this, girl. We will go to the council. We will tell them how you have bewitched the king, how you have used your position to manipulate him, how you have prevented him from fulfilling his duty. We will see you cast out of this palace and into the streets where you belong. Do as you wish," Aveline said, "but you will get nothing from me." The confrontation ended with her parents being escorted from the palace by guards, their threats echoing through the halls. Aveline stood alone in the receiving hall afterward, shaking with rage and grief and the terrible knowledge that everything was about to get worse. Because her parents would do exactly what they threatened. They would go to the council, would spin whatever lies served them. would do everything in their power to destroy the fragile peace she had found. And the council would listen, because her parents' accusations would align perfectly with their own fears and prejudices. She was right. Within days, the council summoned Kale for a private meeting. Aveline did not know what was said, but she saw the aftermath. Kale emerged from that meeting with a face like stone, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with barely suppressed fury. He came to the gardens that evening, his movements sharp and agitated, and when he saw Aveline, he simply stood there for a long moment, his hands clenched into fists. "They have given me an ultimatum," he said finally. Aveline's heart sank at his words. She had known this moment would come, had tried to prepare herself for it, but the reality still hit her like a blow. "What kind of ultimatum?" she asked, though she already knew. "I must choose a mate by the winter solstice," Kale said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "They have presented me with a list of suitable candidates, daughters of powerful families, each alliance carefully calculated to strengthen Valdoran's position. I have 6 weeks to make my selection." 6 weeks. The words echoed in Aveline's mind, hollow and final. 6 weeks until this fragile thing between them shattered completely. She forced herself to nod, to keep her expression neutral. "Then you must choose," she said. "I do not want to choose," Kyle said fiercely. "I do not want any of them." "What you want does not matter," Aveline said, and her voice was steady even though her heart was breaking. "You are a king. You have responsibilities that go beyond personal desire. You must think of the realm, of the future, of everything that depends on you making the right choice." "And what if the right choice is you?" Kale asked, and the rawness in his voice made her flinch. "It is not," Aveline said firmly. "It cannot be. You know this as well as I do." "Because you are infertile," Kyle said bitterly. "Because some village elders declared you worthless based on superstition and ignorance." "It does not matter why," Aveline said. "Only that it is true. I cannot give you heirs. I cannot secure alliances. I cannot be what a queen must be. And even if none of that mattered, even if you could somehow defy the council and choose me anyway, what kind of life would that be? I would be hated by the court, despised by the nobles, seen as the woman who stole the king from his duty. Every problem in the realm would be blamed on me. Every failure would be laid at my feet. And you?" Her voice caught. "You would come to resent me eventually. For making your reign harder. For being the choice that weakened you." "You do not know that," Kale said. "Yes, I do," Aveline replied. "Because I have seen what happens when people like me try to rise above our station. We are destroyed. Every time." She took a breath, steadying herself. "You must choose one of the candidates the council has presented. You must do your duty, and I will be happy for you when you do." "Liar," Kale said softly. Aveline looked away, unable to meet his eyes. "Perhaps. But it is the lie we both need." They stood in silence for a long moment, the autumn wind rustling through the garden, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and approaching winter. Finally, Kale spoke. "If I do this, if I choose one of them and marry as the council demands, what will you do?" "I will continue my work," Aveline said. "I will tend the gardens and live my life and be grateful for the time we had." "Will you stay at the palace?" The question hung heavy between them. Aveline knew what he was really asking. Could she bear to remain here? To watch him with another woman? To see him build a life that she could never be part of? The answer should have been no. Any sane person would leave, would find work elsewhere, would put distance between herself and this impossible situation. But the thought of leaving, of never seeing him again, felt like a death sentence. "I do not know," she admitted. "Can I stay and watch you marry someone else? I do not know if I am that strong." "Then leave," Kale said, and there was desperation in his voice now. "Leave before I make my choice. Go somewhere far from here, somewhere you can start fresh, somewhere you do not have to carry the weight of what might have been." "Where would I go?" Aveline asked. "I have no money, no family who wants me, no skills beyond tending plants. The palace is the only place I have. The gardens are the only home I know." "I will provide for you," Kale said quickly. I will give you enough coin to start a new life wherever you wish. You could open your own apothecary, sell herbs and remedies, live independently. You would not have to be a servant anymore. The offer was generous, almost unbelievably so, but it felt wrong somehow, like payment for services rendered, like a way to ease his guilt. I do not want your money, Aveline said quietly. Then what do you want? Kyle demanded. Tell me what you want, and I will give it to you if I can. Aveline looked at him then, really looked at him, memorizing the planes of his face, the gray of his eyes, the way his hair fell across his forehead. She wanted to tell him the truth. She wanted to say that she wanted him, wanted more time, wanted a world where their circumstances did not matter, and they could simply be two people who had found something rare and precious. But that world did not exist. I want you to be happy, she said instead. I want you to find a mate who can give you everything you need. I want you to rule well and live long and never regret the choices you have made. That is what you want for me, Kale said. What do you want for yourself? Aveline smiled sadly. I stopped wanting things for myself a long time ago. It is easier that way. Kyle closed the distance between them in 2 strides, his hands coming up to cup her face, forcing her to look at him. Promise me something, he said, his voice rough. Promise me that you will not let this world convince you that you are worthless. Promise me that you will remember that there was at least one person who saw you as you truly are and found you extraordinary. Tears spilled down Aveline's cheeks, and she could not stop them. I promise, she whispered. Kale leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers, and for a moment they simply stood there, breathing the same air, sharing the same space, holding on to something that was already slipping away. And then he released her and stepped back. His expression shuddered once more. I will make my choice by the solstice, he said. And after that, we cannot see each other like this anymore. It would not be fair to my mate or to you. I know, Aveline said. He nodded once and turned to leave, his shoulders heavy with the weight of duty and inevitability. Aveline watched him go, and when he disappeared beyond the garden wall, she sank to her knees in the dirt and finally allowed herself to weep. The following weeks passed in a blur of activity. The palace buzzed with preparations for the king's impending choice, and noble families from across Valdoran descended upon the court, each hoping their daughter would be selected. Aveline saw them sometimes, these polished women in their fine dresses and elaborate hairstyles, walking the halls with practiced grace, their eyes calculating as they assessed their competition. They were everything she was not: beautiful, refined, fertile, connected to powerful families who could strengthen the realm. Any one of them would make a suitable queen. Any one of them would give Kale what he needed. Aveline avoided the main palace as much as possible, keeping to the gardens and the lower levels where servants worked, but she could not escape the gossip that swirled through every corner of the palace. The betting among the staff was intense. Some favored Lady Alara Thorne, daughter of a powerful pack lord from the Eastern Territories, known for her beauty and political acumen. Others thought Lady Isadora Vane would be chosen, as her family controlled vital trade routes and had wealth that could bolster Valdoran's coffers. A few whispered that Lady Cecilia Ashford might win the king's favor, as she was young and reportedly kind-hearted, though her family's influence was less significant. Aveline listened to these discussions with a detached numbness. It did not matter who Kyle chose. The outcome would be the same. He would marry, would produce heirs, would move forward with his life, and she would remain here in the gardens, tending plants and trying to forget what it had felt like to matter to someone. 3 weeks before the solstice, everything changed again. News arrived at the palace that sent shockwaves through the court. A rival pack from the Northern Territories, led by a brutal chieftain named Vorik the Red, had launched an incursion across Valdoran's borders. Villages had been raided, farms burned, people killed or taken captive. It was an act of war, a direct challenge to Kale's authority, and it demanded an immediate response. The palace transformed overnight. Soldiers were mobilized, weapons sharpened, supplies gathered. Kale himself would lead the force that rode north to confront Vorik, as tradition and honor demanded. The council argued against it, insisted that the king was too valuable to risk in battle, but Chaol would not be swayed. His people were under attack. He would not hide behind palace walls while others fought and died in his name. Aveline learned all of this from the servants' gossip, from the urgent activity that consumed the palace. She did not see Chaol before he left. He was sequestered with his commanders and advisors, planning strategy, organizing the response. But on the morning he was set to depart, a guard appeared at the garden gate with a message. The king requested her presence in his chambers immediately. Aveline's heart hammered as she followed the guard through the palace. She had never been to Chaol's private quarters, had never been anywhere near the royal wing. The guard led her to a heavy door, knocked once, and gestured for her to enter. She stepped inside and found herself in a large chamber dominated by dark furniture and weapons mounted on the walls. Chaol stood by the window, already dressed in armor, his sword belted at his side. He turned when she entered, and the sight of him took her breath away. He looked every inch the warrior king now, powerful and dangerous, but his eyes when they met hers were the same, storm gray and filled with something she could not name. "You should not be here," Aveline said. "You are about to ride to war. You have more important things." "There is nothing more important than this," Chaol interrupted. He crossed the room toward her, moving with the predatory grace of a born fighter. "I may not return from this battle. Vorik is a formidable enemy, and war is unpredictable. I needed to see you before I left." Aveline's throat tightened. "You will return. You must." "I intend to," Chaol said. "But if I do not, I needed you to know." He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. "I needed you to know that these months with you have been the best of my life, that knowing you has changed me in ways I am still trying to understand, that whatever happens, wherever this life takes me, I will carry the memory of you with me always." Tears burned behind Aveline's eyes. "Do not say goodbye. Not like this." "I am not saying goodbye," Chaol said. "I am saying that you matter, that you have always mattered, and that if I survive this, if I come back, I will find a way to—" He stopped again, shaking his head. "I do not know. I do not have answers. But I know that I am not ready to let you go." Aveline reached up and placed her hand against his chest, feeling the solid thrum of his heartbeat beneath the armor. "Then come back," she said. "Come back alive and whole, and we will figure out the rest." Chaol covered her hand with his, holding it against his heart. "I will try." They stood like that for a long moment, and then Chaol leaned down and pressed his lips to her forehead, a gesture so tender it nearly broke her. "Be safe," he whispered against her skin. "And if I do not return, do not let this world destroy you. You are stronger than you know." And then he was gone, striding from the chamber with the purposeful gait of a man walking toward battle. Aveline stood alone in his rooms, her hand still raised to where his heart had beat beneath her palm, and prayed to gods she did not believe in that he would survive. The days that followed were agonizing. News from the north came in fragments, carried by exhausted messengers who arrived at all hours. The battle was fierce, casualties high on both sides. Chaol's forces had engaged Vorik's pack in a valley between two mountains, a brutal fight that had lasted for days. Reports were contradictory, some claiming victory was near, others suggesting the situation was desperate. The palace held its breath, waiting for definitive word. Aveline threw herself into work, tending the gardens with a fervor that bordered on obsession. She could not eat, could not sleep, could only move from task to task in an attempt to outrun the fear that gnawed at her constantly. Other servants gave her strange looks, whispered that she had lost her mind, but she did not care. If Chaol died in that northern valley, something inside her would die too, and she was not ready to face that possibility. On the 9th day after Chaol had departed, the wounded began to arrive. Wagons rolled through the palace gates carrying soldiers bloodied and broken, men who had fought in the brutal battle and barely survived. The palace healers were overwhelmed, calling for anyone with medical knowledge to assist. Aveline did not hesitate. She abandoned the gardens and made her way to the healing halls, where chaos reigned. The head healer, a severe woman named Moira, looked up when Aveline entered and did not waste time with questions. "You know herbs?" she demanded. Yes. Then make yourself useful. We need poultices for wounds, drafts for pain, anything that will keep these men alive. Aveline worked through the night and into the next day, grinding herbs, mixing salves, applying bandages, holding bowls while soldiers vomited from pain drafts, whispering encouragement to men who wept for their fallen brothers. She moved from bed to bed, her hands stained with blood and medicine, her body exhausted but her mind focused. This she could do. This she was trained for. And if she could not save Kale, at least she could save the men who had fought beside him. On the second day of her work in the healing halls, word finally came. Kyle was alive. Forik had been defeated, killed by the king's own hand in single combat. The incursion had been crushed, the northern borders secured. The king was returning to the palace, bringing his wounded with him. He would arrive within 2 days. Relief flooded through Aveline so powerfully, she nearly collapsed. She steadied herself against a table, breathing hard, tears streaming down her face. He was alive. He had survived. The rest could be dealt with later, but for now, that single fact was enough. When Kale arrived at the palace, Aveline was still in the healing halls. She had not left except to sleep for a few hours in a corner when exhaustion forced her. She was tending to a young soldier whose leg had been badly wounded when the doors burst open and Kale strode in, flanked by his commanders. He looked haggard, his face streaked with dirt and dried blood, his armor dented and scored. But he was whole. He was alive. His eyes swept the hall, taking in the rows of wounded men, the healers moving between them, the organized chaos of the space. And then his gaze found Aveline, and he stopped mid-stride. Something shifted in his expression, something between relief and recognition, and for a moment the entire hall seemed to fall away until there was only the two of them, staring at each other across a room full of wounded warriors. Moira appeared at his elbow, demanding his attention, pulling him toward a patient who needed the king's presence for morale. Kale followed, but his eyes stayed on Aveline for a beat longer, and in that look, she saw everything she needed to know. He had come back, and nothing between them had changed, but the world around them had, because as Aveline worked through the following days, as she saved men who would have died without her knowledge of healing, as word spread through the palace of the servant girl who had labored tirelessly in the healing halls, something remarkable began to happen. The soldiers spoke of her with gratitude. The healers acknowledged her skill. Even some of the nobles, whose sons or brothers had been saved by her care, looked at her with something that was not quite respect, but was no longer contempt. And the council, watching all of this unfold, began to realize that perhaps they had miscalculated. The winter solstice approached with inexorable certainty. Kale had returned from battle victorious, but the victory had come at a cost. Many warriors had fallen, families mourned, and the northern territories remained vulnerable despite Vorik's defeat. The realm needed stability, needed the reassurance that their king was building toward a secure future. The council's pressure for Kyle to choose a mate had only intensified, their arguments now bolstered by the urgency of recent events. A strong alliance through marriage could prevent future incursions, could bind powerful families to Valdoran's cause, could ensure that if Kale fell in battle, there would be heirs to continue his line. Aveline understood this. She had always understood it, but understanding did not make the reality any easier to bear. She continued her work in the healing halls even after most of the wounded had recovered, finding purpose in teaching other servants the healing arts she had learned from old Marin. Moira, the head healer, had recognized her value and requested that she remain permanently assigned to the medical wing. It was an honor, a significant elevation from her previous station, but Aveline could not muster enthusiasm for it. Every day brought her closer to the moment when Kale would make his choice, when he would stand before the court and announce which noble lady would become his queen. 3 days before the solstice, Kyle summoned her to his chambers once more. She went with dread weighing heavy in her chest, knowing what was coming. When she entered, she found him standing by the fireplace, staring into the flames with an expression of profound weariness. He looked older than when she had first seen him, as if the weight of his responsibilities had carved itself into his face. "You sent for me, Your Majesty." Aveline said quietly. Kyle turned to face her, and for a long moment he simply looked at her, his eyes tracing her features as if committing them to memory. I wanted to tell you myself, before the announcement is made public, he said finally. I have made my choice. Aveline's heart constricted, but she kept her expression neutral. Which lady have you chosen? Lady Alara Thorne, Kale said. Her family's alliance will strengthen our eastern borders, and she is intelligent and capable. The council approves. The announcement will be made at the solstice ceremony. She will make a good queen, Aveline said, and was proud that her voice did not shake. Yes, Kale agreed. She will. He paused, then added, She is not you. No, Aveline said, but she is what you need, what the realm needs. Kyle crossed the room toward her, stopping a few feet away as if maintaining distance required physical effort. I want you to know that these months, knowing you, have meant more to me than any alliance or political gain ever could. You showed me that I could be more than just a king, that I could be a man who feels and hopes and wants things beyond duty. And now you must return to being just a king, Aveline said softly. Yes, Kale said, and you must move forward with your life. Moira tells me you have been invaluable in the healing halls. You have saved lives, taught others, proven your worth beyond any measure. You are no longer just a servant, Aveline. You have become essential to this palace. But not to you, Aveline said, and the words came out before she could stop them. Not in the way that matters. Kyle's expression cracked, and for a moment, she saw raw pain in his eyes. You will always matter to me, he said, his voice rough. But I cannot. We cannot. I know, Aveline interrupted. You do not need to explain. I have always known how this would end. She took a breath, steadying herself. I wish you happiness, Your Majesty. I wish you a long life and strong heirs and a mate who loves you as you deserve to be loved. And what about you? Kale asked. What do you wish for yourself? Aveline considered the question. For so long she had trained herself not to want anything, not to hope for more than simple survival. But working in the healing halls had awakened something in her, a sense of purpose that went beyond merely existing. I wish to continue my work, she said, to teach others what I know, to save lives where I can. It is not much, but it is mine. Kyle nodded slowly. Then you shall have it. I will ensure Moira has whatever resources she needs to expand the healing halls, and that you are properly compensated for your work. You will never have to return to the laundries or live in fear of being cast out. This I promise you. Thank you, Your Majesty, Aveline said, and meant it. It was not the life she might have dreamed of in her most reckless moments, but it was more than she had ever expected to have. It was something. She turned to leave, but Kale's voice stopped her. Aveline. She looked back at him, this man who had somehow slipped past all her defenses, who had made her feel seen and valued and whole. Yes? If circumstances were different, he began, then stopped, shaking his head. No, there is no purpose in speaking of what might have been, only what is. He straightened, and she watched as he visibly donned the mantle of kingship once more, tucking away whatever vulnerability he had shown. You may go. Aveline left his chambers for what she knew would be the last time, her chest tight with unshed tears. She did not look back. The solstice ceremony was held in the Great Hall, a massive chamber that had been decorated with winter greenery and thousands of candles. The entire court was in attendance. Nobles dressed in their finest, servants lining the walls. Everyone gathered to witness the Alpha King announce his chosen mate. Aveline stood in the back with the other healing hall staff, her plain dress a stark contrast to the finery surrounding her. She told herself she would not watch, would not torture herself with the sight of Kyle pledging himself to another. But when the ceremony began, she could not look away. Kyle entered the hall in full royal regalia, the crown on his head, his presence commanding immediate silence. He ascended the dais where his throne sat, flanked by his council. Lord Harrow stepped forward to speak, his voice carrying through the hall as he announced that the king would now make known his choice of mate. The noble ladies who had been presented as candidates stood in a line before the throne, each one beautiful and poised and perfect. Kyle's eyes swept over them, and Aveline saw something in his expression she could not quite read. He looked past the noble ladies, out at the assembled crowd, and for just a moment his gaze found hers across the vast hall. Their eyes met, and in that instant Aveline saw regret and resignation, and something that looked like goodbye. And then Kale did something that shocked everyone in the hall. He stood from his throne and descended the dais, walking past the line of noble ladies without glancing at any of them. He walked directly toward the back of the hall, toward where the servants stood, and the crowd parted in confusion as he approached. He stopped in front of Aveline, and the entire hall fell into stunned silence. "Aveline Morcant," he said, his voice carrying through the hushed space. "I name you as my chosen mate." The hall erupted. Nobles shouted in protest. The council members rose from their seats in fury, and servants gasped in shock. But Kyle did not waver. He extended his hand to Aveline, his expression resolute. "If you will have me," he added, quietly enough that only she could hear. "I know I have no right to ask this of you after everything, but I have realized that I cannot live a lie. I cannot pledge myself to someone I do not love when the person I do love is standing in this very room. The council can rage, tradition can demand otherwise, but I am choosing you. If you will choose me in return." Aveline stared at him, her mind reeling. This was madness. This was impossible. The council would never accept it. The nobles would revolt. The entire structure of tradition and hierarchy would come crashing down. And yet here he stood, his hand extended, offering her everything she had convinced herself she could never have. "I am infertile," she said, and her voice carried through the silent hall. "I cannot give you heirs. Then we will name an heir from among my cousins or train a worthy successor," Kale said. "The succession can be secured without requiring you to bear children. What cannot be secured is my ability to rule with integrity if I condemn myself to a loveless political marriage, while the woman I love stands by watching." "The council," Aveline began. "The council serves the king," Kale interrupted, raising his voice so the entire hall could hear. "And the king has made his choice. If they cannot accept it, they are free to challenge me for the throne. But they will not dictate my heart." Lord Harrow stepped forward, his face purple with rage. "This is an outrage. You cannot marry a barren servant girl. You would destroy everything we have built." "No," Kyle said, turning to face the council. "I would transform what we have built into something better. For too long, we have measured worth by bloodlines and fertility, by the ability to produce heirs as if people were livestock. We have cast aside those who did not meet arbitrary standards, condemned them to lives of servitude and shame. And in doing so, we have lost sight of what truly matters: courage, compassion, skill, integrity. Aveline Morcant has more of these qualities than anyone in this hall. She saved the lives of men you sent to war. She worked tirelessly when others would have hidden. She has proven her value 1,000 times over, and I will not dishonor her or myself by pretending that value does not matter simply because she cannot bear children." The hall was in chaos now, nobles shouting, council members arguing, servants whispering frantically. But Aveline heard none of it. She heard only Kale's words, saw only his hand still extended toward her, felt only the impossible hope blooming in her chest. "If I accept," she said quietly, "I will be hated by everyone in this room." "Not by everyone," Kale said. "Not by the soldiers you saved. Not by the healers you have taught. Not by anyone who has seen what you are capable of. And not by me. Never by me." Aveline looked at his hand, then up at his face. At the man who had somehow seen past everything the world had declared her to be, and found something worth choosing. She thought of her mother, who had never loved her, her father, who had sold her, the elders who had condemned her, the servants who had pitied her, the council who had tried to erase her. She thought of every moment she had been told she was worthless, broken, nothing. And then she took his hand. The hall erupted again, but this time Aveline did not care. Kale pulled her forward, his hand warm and solid around hers, and led her to the dais where he turned to face the assembled court. "This is my mate," he announced. "This is my choice, and any who cannot accept it may leave this hall and not return." Several nobles did exactly that, storming from the chamber in fury, but others remained, watching with expressions that ranged from shock to curiosity to grudging acceptance. The soldiers who had been saved in the healing halls began to applaud, and slowly, hesitantly, others joined them. Not everyone, not even most, but enough that the sound filled the hall, enough that Aveline realized not everyone was against them. Lord Harrow stepped forward once more, his expression tight but controlled. "Your Majesty, if you insist on this course, there must be conditions. The succession must be formally secured through adoption of an heir. Lady Aveline," he stumbled over the title, "must prove herself capable of fulfilling the duties of a queen beyond simply standing at your side. And you must understand that this decision will have consequences, political and otherwise." "I accept those conditions," Kale said, "and I will weather those consequences. But my choice stands." The council members looked at each other, clearly realizing they had lost this battle. Lord Harrow gave a stiff bow. "Then we will begin preparations for a formal mating ceremony, though I suspect you have just made both your lives infinitely more complicated." "Undoubtedly," Kale agreed. He turned to Aveline, and his expression softened. "Are you prepared for that? For the complications? The challenges? The people who will resent you simply for existing?" Aveline thought about it honestly. She thought about the struggles ahead, the nobles who would try to undermine her, the courtiers who would gossip and scheme, the endless battle to prove her worth to people who had already decided she had none. And then she thought about Kale, about the peace they had found in each other, about the possibility of building something new in a place that had only ever seen her as broken. "I have survived worse," she said simply. Kale smiled, and it transformed his entire face. "Yes," he said. "You have." The following months were every bit as difficult as Lord Harrow had predicted. The noble families who had hoped to secure alliances through marriage to the king were furious, and several withdrew their support from the crown. Rival pacts saw the situation as weakness and tested Valdorn's borders, requiring Kale to lead multiple expeditions to secure the realm. The court was divided, with some accepting Aveline and others treating her with barely concealed contempt. But Aveline had spent her entire life being treated with contempt. She knew how to endure it, and more than that, she knew how to prove herself through action rather than words. She expanded the healing halls, training more healers, establishing protocols that saved countless lives. She worked with the gardens, increasing the production of medicinal herbs and creating new compounds. She learned the intricacies of court politics and diplomacy, studying late into the night, determined to become the queen Valdorn needed even if she was not the queen they had expected. Kyle formally adopted his cousin's son as his heir, a bright young man named Torin who showed promise as both a warrior and a leader. The succession was secured, the council's primary concern addressed, and slowly, grudgingly, some of the opposition began to soften. Not because they suddenly believed Aveline was worthy, but because she gave them no choice but to recognize her contributions. The truth about Aveline's supposed infertility emerged almost by accident. A traveling healer, renowned throughout the realm, visited the palace and happened to examine some of the medical records from the healing halls. She sought out Aveline privately and asked pointed questions about the fever she had suffered at 15, about the examination the village elders had conducted, about what specific symptoms had led to their diagnosis. "There is nothing in your history that suggests true infertility," the healer said bluntly. "The fever you describe would not cause such a condition. The elders were either ignorant or deliberately cruel. Likely both." The revelation hit Aveline like a blow. For so many years, she had carried that diagnosis as an unalterable truth, had built her entire understanding of herself around it. To learn it had been false all along, that she had been condemned for nothing, that her father had sold her based on a lie. The rage and grief that welled up in her was almost overwhelming. She told Kale that evening, when they were alone in their chambers. He listened in silence, his face growing darker with each word, and when she finished, he pulled her into his arms and held her as she shook with fury and sorrow. "Those bastards," he said quietly. "Those small, cruel bastards who destroyed your childhood over superstition and ignorance." "It does not matter," Aveline said, though her voice was muffled against his chest. "The diagnosis may have been false, but it shaped everything. My parents believed it, the village believed it, I believed it. And even now, knowing the truth, it changes nothing. We have already secured the succession through Turin. We have already moved forward. But it matters to you," Kale said. "It matters that you spent years thinking you were broken when you were whole. It matters that you were punished for something that was never true." "Yes," Aveline admitted. "It matters." They held each other in the firelight, and Aveline felt something shift inside her, some final weight lifting. The diagnosis had been false. She had never been broken. She had been exactly what she was, a person of worth who had been failed by everyone who should have protected her. But she had survived. She had endured. And she had built a life beyond what anyone had thought possible for a girl from Greyholm, with dirt under her nails and herbs in her pockets. When word of the truth reached the council, there was a brief moment where some suggested that Aveline should now be expected to produce heirs after all. But Kale shut that down immediately. "The succession is secured through Turin," he said flatly. "Whether or not my mate can bear children is no longer relevant. What is relevant is that she is an exemplary queen who has proven herself 1,000 times over. This discussion is closed." And so it was. The council backed down, recognizing that they had already lost too many battles over this issue and that Kale would not be moved. 1 year after their mating ceremony, Aveline stood in the newly expanded healing halls and watched as a class of young students learned the properties of various medicinal plants. She had established a formal training program, open to anyone regardless of station or background, that taught healing arts to those who showed aptitude. It was revolutionary for Valdorin, where such knowledge had previously been hoarded by a few established healers, and it was saving lives throughout the realm. Kyle appeared in the doorway, still in his council robes, and watched her teach with a smile on his face. When the lesson ended and the students dispersed, he crossed the room to her. "The council has agreed to your proposal," he said. "The law restricting women to roles based solely on their ability to bear children will be formally abolished. It will take time to change hearts and minds, but the legal framework will no longer support such discrimination." Aveline felt tears prick her eyes. It was a small victory in the grand scheme of things, but it mattered. It meant that girls like her, condemned for circumstances beyond their control, would have other options, other possibilities. "Thank you," she said. "You did this," Kale said. "You proved through your own example that worth cannot be measured by a single attribute. You forced them to see what I saw from the beginning, that you are extraordinary." Aveline leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. "I never wanted to be extraordinary," she said. "I only wanted to survive." "You did more than survive," Kyle said quietly. "You transformed us all." They stood together in the healing halls as afternoon light streamed through the windows, and Aveline thought about the journey that had brought her here. From the cold cottage in Greyholm, to the palace gardens, to the laundries, to this place of purpose and meaning. From a girl who had been declared worthless to a woman who had redefined what value meant. The path had been brutal, and the scars ran deep, but she had walked it. She had endured, and she had won. Not in the way she had ever imagined, because she had never allowed herself to imagine victory at all, but in the way that mattered most. She had claimed her own life, her own worth, her own destiny. She had refused to accept the world's verdict on her existence. And in doing so, she had changed that world, however slightly, for those who would come after. That evening, as she and Kale walked the palace gardens where they had first spoken years before, Aveline paused beside the bed of rosemary she had tended in those early days. The plants were thriving, their scent filling the air, their leaves green and vital. Like her, they had survived harsh conditions and emerged stronger for it. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Kale. "Choosing me over a political alliance? Making your reign more difficult than it needed to be?" Kyle looked at her, and in his eyes she saw everything she needed to know. "Never," he said simply. "You were the only choice that mattered, the only choice that was real." They stood together in the twilight as the first stars appeared overhead, two people who had found each other against impossible odds, who had built something new from the ruins of what should have destroyed them. The future was uncertain, the challenges ahead numerous, but they would face them together. King and queen, alpha and mate, two souls who had refused to accept the limits the world had tried to impose and who had created their own story instead. And in the gardens of Valdoran, where a servant girl had once knelt in the dirt and never dared to hope for more, the herbs grew strong and the future bloomed with possibility.